Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that kind of flips a really popular modern narrative completely on its head. Based on some recent insights from historian Davis Hanson, we are exploring a pretty provocative idea. Is the narrative of inevitable American decline fundamentally flawed? We're going to break down the hard data to see exactly why he argues America is the real crouching tiger, and why he believes the United States is currently being wildly underestimated on the global stage.
Okay, let's dive right into this outline. We're going to be looking at the declinism narrative, the resource advantage, military and tech might, the economic reality, and then we'll wrap it all up with history's big fears.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the declinism narrative, a Western tradition. So before we even think about looking at military assets or GDP numbers, we really need to understand the psychology at play here. According to Hanson, this idea of declinism, it's practically baked into the DNA of the West. I mean, for 2.5 millennia, this specific kind of cultural anxiety has been a totally normal, recurring feature of free, self-critical societies. It is actually incredibly common for us to convince ourselves that our best days are behind us and, that our downfall is just absolutely inevitable. So this current belief that American decline is an absolute certainty, historically speaking, it's nothing new at all. It's just kind of how free societies tend to evaluate themselves.
And this brilliantly illustrates Hanson's core thesis. It all comes down to foundational stability. Basically, does a society have constitutional stability and continuity? The United States has this deep-rooted constitutional bedrock. China does not. And Hanson argues that this foundational bedrock matters way more in the long run than, say, passing geopolitical trends or short-term cultural panics.
Moving right along to Section 2, the resource advantage, specifically fuels and food. When you're sizing up a global superpower, you really have to start with the fundamental building blocks of national power. And there's a stark contrast here. The United States is currently the largest producer of gas and oil in the history of civilization. Let that sink in. Meanwhile, China, they have to import 10 million barrels of oil every single day just to keep the lights on and their economy running. And the gap is just as crazy when it comes to food. The US is literally the world's largest food exporter. China, which used to be highly self-sufficient, now imports 30% of its entire food supply. So in terms of essential fuels and food, the structural advantage for the US is massive.
Then we've got the demographic foundation. Right now, the US fertility rate sits at 1.7. Now, sure, that's not exactly a baby boom, but for a Western nation, it is remarkably robust, especially compared to China's 1.0. A shrinking and aging population is a massive structural hurdle to jump over. Hanson points to this as a severe, long-term disadvantage that's going to put immense pressure on China's future economic and societal stability.
Okay, Section 3, military and tech might. Let's look at the strategic advantages.
Now, what's really interesting about the naval data isn't just the sheer numerical advantage, 11 U.S. carrier groups to China's 3, it's actually the context of experience. The United States has a full century of institutional mastery when it comes to conducting complex aircraft carrier operations, 100 years. China, by comparison, has only been attempting carrier operations for about 15 years. So we're talking about a vast disparity in both the actual hardware and the operational mastery required to run it effectively.
And we see a similarly massive disparity in strategic arsenals. The U.S. maintains a stockpile of somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 nuclear weapons, compared to China's roughly 600. Now, Beijing is actively attempting to close that gap, but the current reality heavily favors the American strategic deterrent.
This momentum spills right over into the innovation frontier, too. The U.S. has firmly reclaimed the lead in artificial intelligence. And when you look up at space, it's kind of staggering. A single private American citizen, Elon Musk, launches more satellites than most of the rest of the world combined. And that's even before we factor in the continuous forward-driving work of NASA. The indicators in advanced tech remain heavily weighted toward the United States.
Let's pivot to Section 4, the economic reality. Time for a GDP comparison.
Now, China's transformation from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse over the last 50 years is astonishing. It is absolutely crucial to acknowledge that fact. But think back to a decade ago. We were repeatedly told that the Chinese economy would inevitably pass the U.S. Well, consider the actual $10 trillion gap today. The U.S. sits at roughly a $30 trillion annual GDP, while China is at $20 trillion. That predicted overtaking, it simply hasn't happened yet.
So the crucial point here is understanding the per capita productivity behind those giant numbers. Because of the massive population difference,
We're talking 340 million Americans compared to 1.4 billion Chinese. It takes roughly 4 Chinese residents to produce just 60% of the GDP of a single American. That highlights a staggering difference in economic efficiency and individual productivity between the two nations.
Finally, Section 5. History's Big Fears. The Pattern of Panic.
To truly understand today's anxiety about China, we really have to look at the pattern of the past century. Let's step back and see how this builds a chronological picture of Western panic. Back in the 1930s, the narrative was that fascism and the Luftwaffe were basically unstoppable. Then in the post-war 50s, it was the Soviets and global communism that were going to sweep the globe. Jump to the 80s, and Japan Inc. was buying up American icons like Rockefeller Center. In the 2000s, it was the United EU and the Euro that were definitely going to overtake us. In every single era, the West was completely convinced a foreign power would overwhelm them. And spoiler alert, none of these doomsday scenarios actually materialized.
Which leads us to the ultimate takeaway here. Yes, China is making gains. Their rise over the last half-century is an astonishing advance, no doubt about it. But achieving actual true parity with the United States, that is an entirely different beast. As Hanson puts it, China is simply the next big fear, but it's just not materializing the way we were told it would. And that leaves us with a really profound question. Given the hard data on resources, military reach, and economic output, and, our 2,500-year habit of predicting our own downfall, we have to ask, is China truly a unique, unprecedented geopolitical threat, or are we just stuck in a familiar cycle of panic, kind of blinded to our own advantages? It's definitely a fascinating lens through which to view global politics. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep seeking the structure behind the story.